Ladies and gentlemen, a very warm welcome to the afternoon session with the star of journalism from South Asia, Mishal Hussain, the face we've seen over the many years on BBC. Mishal's book, Broken Threads, is a moving account of familial stories that were structured around the partition, the creation of Pakistan, and how families were splintered across the border. Mishal's family is particularly a case, like my own family, of how families are across the border and how we suffer because of the different restrictions on travel, communications, and so on. I wish relations between the two states could improve, and I wish that both sides could enter a détente, an engagement process, so that writers, authors, poets, families, friends could visit each other. I'm really honored to have Mishal here with us, and I'm proud of this book because it's part of the important storytelling tradition that ought to be captured, especially for the young audiences here. I'm honored to have Her Excellency Jane Marriott, British High Commissioner of UK, to be the chair for this session. A very warm welcome to Jane Marriott. I want to quickly thank everyone for their support. It's been going well. We're almost halfway through the LLF's 13th edition. So do spread the word, bring more friends and family, and a big shout out to all our wonderful volunteers who've been working diligently, responsibly, and showing such remarkable courtesies for all our guests. Over to Jane. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's great to have you all here this afternoon. Normally the post-lunch slot is a dull one, but today you've probably got one of the best people, I think, to enliven you after lunch. Mishal Hussain, of course, is a journalist, broadcaster, author, most famously from a British perspective on the Today programme, the UK's flagship agenda-setting news programme for the last 11 years, and is about to launch a new global interview show for Bloomberg in 2025. She was very prominent on our screens in the United Kingdom last year when interviewing the prime ministerial candidates, the leaders of the main political parties, at what was quite an interesting election for the United Kingdom. I'm not quite sure how you compare that to interviewing Prince Harry and Meghan, as you did back in 2017.
It was more fun, for sure.
Yeah, I think that was definitely more fun. But we're here today to talk about your book, Broken Threads. Hope many of you have got a copy. It is an absolutely brilliant read, Mishal. And you talk us through four people, Shahid and Tahira, your grandparents on your mother's side, and Mumtaz and Mary, your grandparents on your father's side. And in the book, you brilliantly and expertly weave major geopolitical events with these four people who I think became less grandparents and more individuals as this book was going on. But tell us a little about your process. Why did you decide this was a story worth telling, and why did you decide to do it in this way?
Jane, I want to thank you, first of all, for being my interviewer on this occasion. I'm much more used to interviewing ambassadors than the other way around. In fact,
It's great fun. It's
I've never had this reverse experience before, but I'm really grateful to you for agreeing to do this, and it's lovely to be talking about the book in Pakistan only for the second time. And the nature of being here talking about it is that I know there are members of my family and people related to the individuals in this book, which has my two grandmothers on the cover right here in this audience. So I think I always knew that my grandparents had lived through momentous times, and just in generational terms, we're talking about people born in South Asia in the early part of the 20th century, so almost all of you here in the room will be able to relate to that. And of course, that meant that the aftermath of the First World War, or even the aftermath of the 1857 uprising against the British, these had all affected their lives in one way or another, and then they themselves lived through non-cooperation, the Gandhian movement, the Second World War, and then this dramatic period between 1945 and 1947. So I knew that there was a story there, but I didn't really know how to put it together. And so when I started writing the book, I thought, okay, I'm going to write a story about these 4 individuals and social mobility and the acquisition of education and navigating between the Raj and being citizens of independent countries. But it slowly became a much more historical and much more political book. And I was initially quite afraid of that. But the reason it became that is because I thought, I can't understand these 4 people, who I did start to think of on first name terms, not by what I called them as my grandparents. I can't understand them without really understanding their times. And that meant getting to grips with this extraordinary complex political and colonial history. Roundtable conferences, negotiations of different kinds, cabinet mission plans. So the book in that way weaves between individual stories and big politics and history. If you like, it's sort of individuals and then a much more macro level. And that was what I wanted to bring together. And there was something that I quote from something that my grandmother left behind, my grandmother Tahira, who had sort of thought maybe she would write a memoir, but never got around to it. But I did find this one fragment of paper which kind of encapsulated this idea of a generational story. So on this piece of paper, she wrote the following: as a young army officer's wife, I went through the Second World War. We had seen the emergence of Hitler, and it was nothing short of a miracle to witness his fall. The emergence of a personality like Gorbachev, she was writing in the late 1980s, endeavoring to put an end to Russian expansionism is yet another miracle which may bring endless peace to mankind. And so one lives in the hope that to every action there is a reaction. It was, to my delight, intended to be the start of a memoir. For some years now, Tahira said, I've felt the urge to put my reactions to so much that happens around me on paper. In years to come, it may become a comprehensive and objective account of events that have shaped our destiny. Going back to when the concept of Pakistan had been accepted, a separate Muslim state to be carved out of India, I was politically not mature enough to realize the gravity of events taking place around me. So she never wrote a book, but I pieced together her story and others and used it to tell the story of their times.
Amazing, and you've used a very different types of source material here, and I think, as we look in a world that is full of, in some ways, too much information, you're at an era where there wasn't that much information, but facts were so important, perspectives. And I remember on when you're looking at one particular general, you're like, my grandfather really liked this guy, and I wasn't sure that my grandfather was right, so I went back and checked. Talk us through the source material that you've used and how you sort of fact-checked it effectively.
Yes, I did have to fact-check it because I was writing this book as a journalist, at the time a BBC journalist, but a journalist with a certain attitude and an objectivity that is always going to be a part of my professional and personal life, really, wherever I work. So I was fortunate in that I had a starting point. I had published work from my grandfather Shahid. I had some audio tapes from my grandmother Tahira, which my mother had had the foresight to record. I had an unpublished memoir of my other grandfather, Mumtaz, who joined the British Indian Army Medical Service straight out of King Edward Medical College here in Lahore, because he graduated in the middle of the Second World War. And then for my grandmother Mary, who was the one non-Muslim, she was a Catholic amongst my 4 grandparents, I had a surviving sibling, because I have a great aunt Anne who's 100 years old and lives near Manchester. And she was able to tell me about her childhood and Mary's childhood, and I recorded her speaking. So I had these sources, but I did fact check my own grandparents. I mean, certainly Shahid worked for Field Marshal Auchinleck, who was the last British chief of the Indian Army, and of the pre-independence Indian Army. And I sat in the archive that Auchinleck left to Manchester University and read his papers and tried to form my own independent view of this man, and came to the conclusion that my grandparents were absolutely right to hold him in such high regard, because he was an incredible individual who very sadly has been forgotten by British history. And I think, in a lesson to all journalists, I think really it was because he didn't do, Claude Auchinleck did not do personal PR. And I realized after I looked into his life that, you know, like they say, history is written by the victors, history is also written. Churchill made sure that he wrote the history of the Second World War himself. And when people, Boris Johnson has a great, and now every political leader makes sure they write their memoirs. These are really important to the passage of time for cementing their own reputation. But yes, and I'm happy to say that for the most part, in fact, completely, all the things that my grandparents said or wrote checked out. My grandfather Shahid's account of Burma and this extraordinary domino effect of being in Burma in 1942 and the way that, you know, one great British bastion in East Asia after another fell to the Japanese. That entire sequence of events checked out. So from the big history to the tiny details. At one point, Shahid wrote about his childhood in Lucknow and said, I went to school with 3 Sikh brothers, and one of them married Svetlana Stalin. And I read these words and I thought, how can this be? And then I looked up, and sure enough, there was an Indian who, Svetlana Stalin, and whether they were officially formally married or not, I don't know, but they certainly regarded themselves as husband and wife. And it was when she came to Delhi to scatter his ashes that she defected to the US Embassy. So, you know, from the small to the large, what they said did check out, and I was delighted to discover that.
That's fantastic. And in there you kind of use these, in many ways, these small moments to expand into these wider geopolitical themes. And I'd love to explore a couple of these with you now. And one of them is around, you know, both your grandmothers, Tahira and Mary, were impressive women in their own right. They'd gone to study medicine. They were in a medical setting separately. They hadn't met each other at that stage. Careers that they gave up to become good wives, good mothers, and be the stability throughout what were very tumultuous times. What do you think that would have been like if they had been born today, or if you had been born in there? What does 3 generations of women look like in your family in terms of opportunities?
It's such an important question, Jane, because there is such a distinct generational, such a difference with each of those generations. So my grandmothers, Tahira and Mary came here to Lahore all the way across India. She was born in Visakhapatnam, between Madras and present-day Chennai and Calcutta. And she had a very difficult early childhood because her father died when she was 11. And in those times, and even today, if a child loses a parent, particularly a father early on, your life chances, your education are usually severely affected. And that was the case with Mary, had it not been for the intervention of the nuns who educated her and her siblings, who essentially deferred fees and said they could stay in school, and who then said to her, this Anglo-Indian girl from Southeast India, that there was a very good hospital in Lahore called the Mayo Hospital, which was a very good place for nurse training. And so she traveled, can you imagine, like 2 nights and 3 days to come from Vizag to Lahore in 1940 to train as a nurse. And this was completely different from any opportunity her mother had had. And similarly, my grandmother Tahira, unusually for a Muslim girl born in 1920 in Aligarh, came to Delhi to train as a medical student when very few unmarried Muslim women would have been living away from home. So in both those cases, they had opportunities that were different from their mothers. It was also still a time when to work after marriage would have been unusual, although there were other peers of theirs who certainly did it, and full credit to them. And of course then, you know, another generation, my mother and my aunt, graduates and postgraduates and do work, and then my life is obviously, you know, has been very different. But I think each generation has to make its peace with its choices. And, you know, I've obviously been very fortunate in my career, and I also have a family, and my boys are grown up now, but I had 3 children under 2 at one stage. My hands were very full, and I remember thinking my only template was a wonderful mother who was there all the time. And it was, at least when I was little, and it was my mother who liberated me in many ways and said, do not think you have to do the things that I did. You do not have to be at the school gates. You do not have to be there every single night when they go to bed, because your life is different. And that was such a gift she gave me, because you do model yourself on your own mother. And so when your life is very different to your own mother's, it can be a very tricky thing to come to terms with, but she's the one who helped me do that.
I think just looking at the generations, we're always standing on the shoulders of the generation before us, whether we're men or women or other, and the importance of recognizing what they have sacrificed in order for us to be able to become what we have become. I think, my grandparents would be astounded that I was a High Commissioner. I suspect your grandparents would be like, what do you mean? Our little Michelle sat on this stage, a global household name, absolutely amazing. But my favorite anecdote in the whole book is about religion. So you just mentioned there, Mary was Catholic. And I have to say, when I first came to the book, I'm like, wait, hold on, one of your grandparents was Catholic? How does that figure? But she was a committed Catholic to the end of her life. Her husband, Mumtaz, was a committed Muslim to the end of his life. How did that work, particularly back then?
Well, I asked my grandfather, Mumtaz, how it worked, because Mary died when I was 11, so I never got the chance to ask her this question herself. But, he began every day reading from the same Quran that he was given when he left home in Multan to come to Lahore and become a student at King Edward, which was a huge thing in his family. He came from a conservative home in the old city of Multan. He was born in the house where his parents thought that, he would live for the rest of his days. And to go away from home in those days was a really big thing. And he resisted marriage to his cousin, which is still something that is a part of many people's lives. And so when I asked him, how did this work? Because I also remembered him driving my grandmother to Mass. And he said, it worked perfectly. We were both people of deep faith. And therefore, we understood each other. If she had had no faith, I think each of us, the fact that each of them had faith was what was really important. So there is a bit in the book I'd love to share, which was when they decided that they would get married. This is early 1942. Civil marriage was possible in British India, but it was not acceptable to either of them. And so they had to work out how to get married according to both of their faiths. Mumtaz had told his parents nothing about Mary, but having a nikah, a Muslim marriage, would be of help when it came to breaking the news. And for Mary, the sacrament of a church marriage was essential. They began to explore options, each according to their own faith, starting with their usual places of worship. The obstacles became immediately apparent. Mumtaz's regular mosque, attached to the Nila Gumbad shrine, told him that his fiancée would have to convert to Islam. This is actually not correct. This, he knew, she did not want, nor was it something he would ask of her. To me, renunciation of one's faith for a matter of expediency alone has always been repugnant, he wrote, but when other mosques gave him the same response, he started to lose heart. It was then that his friend Jimmy got involved. Jimmy was a Parsi, not a Muslim, but he went from mosque to mosque speaking to imams until he finally had a positive answer at the Australia Mosque near Lahore's railway station. I'm sure this mosque still exists, some of you will know it. Here the imam saw no difficulty. After all, he said, Muslims, Christians and Jews were all people of the book in the language of the Quran, and the Prophet himself had had a Christian wife. Even this did not entirely solve the problem, as Mary was struggling with the church element. Her priest had rejected outright the idea of marrying a Muslim. She had gone on to Lahore Cathedral, but the response there was even sterner. She should forget this boy and seek guidance from the Holy Spirit. Again, it was Jimmy who continued the search, convinced that more flexible priests might be found in the smaller churches. He was right. An Irish priest further out of the neighborhood was more sympathetic and willing to meet Mary and Mumtaz. He questioned us at length about the sincerity of our commitment, particularly mine, Mumtaz said, and after that he appeared persuaded. Pronouncing the bishop and others they'd consulted as rigid Englishmen, he said he was prepared to ask for a dispensation from the Pope and marry them, as long as Mumtaz allowed Mary to continue to practice her faith and any children to be brought up as Catholics. Mumtaz hesitated over the second condition, but said that if it was Mary's wish, he agreed. Within a week, he heard that the dispensation had been granted, and he rushed off on his bicycle to give the news to Mary, who was on shift at the Lady Willingdon Maternity Hospital. We threw caution to the winds and hugged each other in the middle of the ward, he said, to the consternation and later applause of the patients and staff once they came to know the reason.
Well, but it wasn't easy for Mary Mumtaz, was it? I mean, not least because Mumtaz's parents had wanted him to marry his cousin Rahiba. So there's that pressure that was constant, even once he had married Mary, you know, why not take a second wife, etc. And then even on the other side, when finally Mumtaz got to meet Mary's beloved Catholic nuns, I love the anecdote where one of them is saying, you know, when are you going to convert? And he says, well, sister, when I see the light. And sort of for the next 20 years, she's going, have you seen the light yet, Mumtaz? And he's like, not yet, sister, I'm still looking. It's just absolutely brilliant.
It was a very good diplomatic answer, I think.
Very, yeah, I was taking notes there. It was fantastic. But the role of minorities and religion ends up playing such an important role, not just in that marriage, but of course in the entire book, because this is what it's all about, particularly as we get towards that sort of point of partition. But before then, both your grandfathers, but particularly Shahid, quite often found themselves as the only Indian officers in the room, in a room of British officers who were not really sure about this. Talk us a little bit through what they felt and how it impacted them.
Well, in some ways, you see, Shahid and Mumtaz were fortunate in their timing, in that they joined the British Indian Army at a point where there was much more awareness that things were going to have to change from the old days. So it was only after the First World War that natives, in the parlance of the time, were allowed to become officers, King's Commissioned officers for the first time. And so in some ways it was a time of progress, certainly much more by the time Mumtaz joined, which was during the Second World War. Being on a war footing, you know, just it's sort of all hands on deck, and there's much more awareness of there's a much more egalitarian attitude between the races. But when Shahid joined in the mid-1930s, the process of Indianization was still controversial, and there were certainly British officers who were desperately against it. That was clear. Didn't like people like these young Indians coming through. So they did have to navigate those times, which they did with some difficulty. And yes, the question of minorities absolutely runs through the book, because, you know, Shahid and Taira, my maternal grandparents, their homes were in places that are now in India, Lucknow and Aligarh, both very much resonant with either the Muslim Nawabs of what was then Awadh, or indeed with Muslim advancement through the university at Aligarh that was founded by Sir Syed Ahmad Khan. And they very much made the choice for Pakistan, and they had parents and siblings, and, you know, the families were divided. They lost their friends, which I think was a great sadness in their lives, their Indian brother officers, who they never saw again for the most part. But yes, I mean, the military is certainly a big theme in the book. And there is a moment, though, that really made me think about identity. And I always thought about all my grandparents as Pakistani inside and out, and my identity as a second generation British Pakistani, because my father came to England to join the NHS in the mid-1960s. And yet, when I was writing the book, my cousins in Islamabad happened to one of them put their hand into an old piece of furniture in what was my grandmother's last home in Islamabad, and found a passport. And it was the passport that my grandfather had issued in 1932 when he was leaving to join Sandhurst, because he had won a place at Sandhurst. And I flicked through the passport, not really imagining I would find anything that interesting. And then I saw his national status, and his national status was British subject by birth. And I thought, how interesting. This is not an age when you talk about citizenship. People are subjects, not citizens. But still, he was a British subject by birth, which was something I never thought of. And I thought, in a way, this is changing my concept of my identity. And, you know, that's the same, almost all of you here, even if your grandparents or great-grandparents had never been to the UK, they would also have been born British subjects by birth. It's just that most people didn't have passports made, so it was never written down in black and white. But I feel it sort of added a different sense to me of my own identity.
No, absolutely. And I want to come back in a minute to a bit of that sort of partition identity, people who consider themselves Muslim but in Indian areas, and you know, that choice that individuals had to make that was so heartbreaking in many ways. But Shahid in particular had a real ringside seat to history, but also helped make and shape history. He wasn't just watching, he was playing a crucial role in this. So particularly when he was working for Field Marshal Auchinleck, or the Auk, as he was called, he saw that real tension rising with Lord Mountbatten, the way in which Mountbatten seemed to be favouring Nehru. Mountbatten didn't like Jinnah. At one point, Mountbatten tries to get rid of Shahid because he objects to Auchinleck having a Muslim on his staff, although not a Hindu. And actually, Shahid and Tahira play this key role when Shahid suddenly realizes that Pakistan is about to be formed, but actually Jinnah has got no connection with the military, with the men, they were all men then, who were going off to form what would become the Pakistani army. And so he and Tahira gather them at their garden so Jinnah can introduce himself before he flies off to Karachi 3 days later and the whole process begins. Tell us a little bit more about his role in history. You know, he was Officer PA 27. Why don't we know more about him?
So, yeah, he was the 27th most senior officer in the Pakistan Army at the time of inception. I don't know what numbers we're into nowadays, but you know, hundreds of thousands maybe, you know, since that time, or even more. So that was his Pakistan Army number. He, in early 1946, so remember this period of Indianization had happened not just in the army, but in the civil service and elsewhere, but there were limits to it. And in 1946, Shahid had this very unusual call to his commanding officer. He was based at Saharanpur, north of Delhi, saying, "You're required at GHQ in Delhi." And he went to Delhi not knowing why he was called, and he was asked to come to one office after another. And he just has this sense everyone is scrutinizing him, all these senior British officers, one general after another, the Adjutant General and the Master General of Ordnance, etc., etc. And finally, he's asked to go for lunch with the chief, who's Auchinleck. And again, it's a sort of general conversation, and they talk about gardening and trees. And he, again, doesn't really know why he's there, but he gets the impression it's a job interview. And essentially, Auchinleck had decided that he would like to have an Indian serving as his private secretary for the first time. This was a very significant moment, because until then, Muslim and Hindu and Sikh officers might have been ADCs, which is a much more ceremonial role, but a private secretary has access to all your papers, sees, everything that comes past your desk and the things you decide on that go back, that is what will be seen by the team. So it's a very sensitive post. And it had been decided, and to this day, no one knows, well, fine, that was decided, but who recommended this young Shahid Hamid, who I think maybe was a major or perhaps a colonel? And Shahid was appointed to this job, and he struck up a real bond with Auchinleck from the beginning. And I think it really was personal. Auchinleck had no children. His marriage had just broken up. It was a great scandal in Delhi of the time because his wife had run off with a fellow officer, a senior Air Force officer, and Shahid had recently lost his father. So I think it was almost like a father-son relationship. And Shahid and Tahira were very aware that Auchinleck was a great general of the Second World War, that really his actions in North Africa in 1942 stopped the Nazis at a point when they were sweeping across North Africa, they were sweeping through Russia down towards Stalingrad. The Japanese had already swept across East Asia and had taken Burma. And yet the credit for the victory at El Alamein was completely claimed by Field Marshal Montgomery. So they were very aware that he was a great commander of the Second World War and very protective of Auchinleck. But in the last days before independence, so in August 1947, they also knew the Qaid and Qaid-e-Azam, and they realized that very few of those army officers who were opting for Pakistan had ever met the Qaid. And so one day Shahid said to him, Sir, you know, I think you should meet some of these people. They're opting for the country that you're leading without ever seeing you. And the Qaid said, what do you suggest? And he said, well, I could gather a few of them and Taira and I could have a reception. And that's exactly what happened in the house in Delhi, which has been occupied by many Indian ministers since. And the Qaid spoke to the officers and they asked him questions. One officer asked him about the chances of promotion in the Pakistan army, and everyone could see that the Qaid was very annoyed by this question and looked the person up and down before saying all promotions will come in due course. No one should be in a hurry. And then he made a point of saying anyone who seeks political power through the army should not come to Pakistan because all soldiers will take their orders from duly elected politicians. And so I'm very grateful to my grandfather for writing this down, because these are words that have really been forgotten, and I absolutely trust my you know, everything my grandfather has said has checked out. So I think it's really valuable that he put these words down. But yes, they came to Pakistan, both couples, and here I must really pay tribute to my grandmother Mary, because Mumtaz his family were from Multan, so it was sort of pretty obvious. And in the rules of the army at the time, when the British Indian Army was being divided, a Muslim officer from territory that was becoming Pakistan had to opt for Pakistan, did not have a choice. But my grandfather Mumtaz's Hindu colleagues at air headquarters in Delhi were very worried about this, and at one point said, how can you take Mary to a bigoted place like Pakistan? And Mumtaz said, there's evidence of bigotry all around us. You know, no one had a monopoly on bigotry at that time, or indeed subsequently. But he did wonder if maybe he should try and stay in India. And he thought, well, maybe we could go and live with Mary's widowed mother, and maybe I could farm in what is now Andhra Pradesh. And it was Mary, despite the fact all her family would be left behind in India, said, don't be ridiculous. You, a Punjabi, you will never manage in the south of India. You don't speak the language. You'll be a fish out of water, and you are an only son to your parents, and they will need you in their old age. So we must go to Pakistan. So she made her home in Pakistan. This is where they lived. This is where they retired. And sadly, she died quite soon after they retired. So they didn't have as much time together, you know, in their old age as they would have liked. But I think she was an incredible woman.
Certainly both of the women sound incredibly impressive, and as ever, the achievements of their men, their husbands, are tremendous, but possibly only possible because they've got women like Mary. I'm thinking, at one point, Mary was also saying, no, go to Delhi, take the job, or was Tira, take the job, take the opportunity, Shahid's wife as well. You talk a lot in the book around minorities because it is such a key issue, because actually everybody is a minority and everybody is a majority depending on where you physically are at any given moment. And the absolute horrors of partition, the speed in which it was done, the sort of coming south of Hindus and Sikhs, and they're going northwest of Muslims.
East and west.
East and west, I suppose, yes. And you talk a little bit about the ghost trains, because of course Mumtaz and Mary were meant to be on one of the trains that when it did arrive, it arrived full of bodies. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so as it happens, and this will be, you know, I think most people here will be very familiar with these narratives, and I was also very keen to make sure that in this book, while I do deal with the horrors of the actual time of independence, I did want to paint a portrait of the society that existed and the incredible bonds across communities and the incredible kindnesses across communities that also existed. So I dealt with all of that because I think perhaps not enough has been said about the ways that people did reach out and help each other, and a lot more has been said and written about the horrors. But perhaps I do relate to the sense of minorities making choices and life as a minority, because I live as part of a minority community in the UK, and therefore perhaps I have to navigate that world while being true to who I am. And I think perhaps I have a certain sensitivity, and I'm drawn towards those stories. But both Shahid and Taira and Mary and Mumtaz, because of their forces connections, although they were not senior officers, but it was thanks to being in the army that they avoided the trains, and both ended up on planes out of Delhi. And both couples looked down from the aircraft windows and saw Delhi burning. At that stage, there were reprisals against the Muslims in Delhi because of what Hindu and Sikh refugees who had come from Pakistan had seen and experienced. But I also want to say that among the many kindnesses, Shahid and Taira, their first home in Pakistan was Flashman's Hotel on the Mall in Rawalpindi, because there was no army accommodation. And nearby, there was a very prominent house, which is, some of you will know it. It's now Fatima Jinnah University in Rawalpindi, but it was the home of a very prominent Sikh industrialist called Sardar Mohan Singh. And Sardar Mohan Singh had known Shahid and his family. And he had already left Pakistan for India before partition and independence. But he found out that Shahid and Taira were in Rawalpindi, that they'd been posted there. And he wrote to them to say, please use my house. The house is there, the staff are there, you will be comfortable. And Taira was quite tempted because she was living in 2 hotel rooms. And Shahid said, it was a house full of treasures, art, antiques. He was a great collector of everything from Buddhas to illuminated copies of the Quran to Gandhara art, everything. And he said, we can't possibly take responsibility for a house like that. And so they didn't. And Shahid asked for a police guard to be put on the house, but it ended up being looted very sadly. But I thought how incredible that a man like Mohan Singh, who'd been forced out of his own house into safety in India, wanted these people to live in it. And just before Taira left Delhi, there was a young officer on Auchinleck's staff called Govind Singh, who was a Hindu, who came to her with a sort of box probably about the size of this book, and she was just about to leave Delhi. And he said, I'd like you to have this. And she opened the box, and it was full of jewelry. And she knew he was related to the royal family of Jaipur. And she said, Gomji, which is what she called him, she said, I can't possibly accept this. And he said, this does not belong to the state. These are my personal items, and I would like you to have them because you are not rich people. And one day, the girls will need to get married. You're talking about my mother aged 2 and my aunt aged 5. But he said, you will need these because the children will need to get married one day. And she said, no, I cannot accept this. But I think it's another astounding gesture that, these people are going away. They never saw each other again. But he made this extraordinarily generous gesture to a family, having actually already brought my grandmother to safety from Simla to Delhi with a platoon of infantry because my grandfather had already left for Pakistan. So, it was an extraordinary time of where you see the best and worst of people.
I think for me, the most heart-rending moment in the book is where you're talking about the movement of refugees in both directions. And of course, pretty much everyone's had a horrible experience. They've had to leave their homes. They've often not been able to take what they wanted. And the sort of building up of the other as the enemy. And then there's this moment that you describe where sort of those heading east and those heading west sort of almost lock eyes. And they suddenly realize that they are the same person.
Yes.
They're going through exactly the same experience.
It must have happened more than once, but the account that I put in the book comes from a civil servant called Edward Pendrell Moon who witnessed it. He was stationed in Bhavalpur at the time of independence, and then he ended up being responsible for helping to get Hindus and Sikhs to India. And yes, he described seeing this moment where a train which was coming of Hindus and Sikhs from Multan. So I read this account and thought, were these some of the neighbors of my grandfather Mumtaz? And they're coming to the border, and then they lock eyes with a train coming the other way. And often these trains they had to be held, because if a train did come in one direction that was a ghost train, it was full of bodies, then the train in the opposite direction was held, because there would be, likely there would be reprisals. And so yes, The best of times, and I mean the worst of times in so many ways. I only mean the best in that there were instances of real valor.
Yeah, and those personal connections, people going out of their way to help each other. And I think sort of maybe fast forwarding it to the modern day world, so often oppression of minorities is around the fear of other. So, you know, I've sort of seen this in my own lifetime in the UK, where perhaps I'm from the north of England and you'd have somebody saying, you know, oh, I don't like a certain group of people. I don't like Indians, I don't like Pakistanis, and then in the same breath they'll say, anyway, I'm going out with Mrs. Patel on Saturday night, and you're like, okay, who's Mrs. Patel? Oh, she's the lady who came from India who runs a local corner store. She's my best friend. So it's this kind of once you have experience of something, actually you realize how very humanizing we all are.
Which is why integrated education is so important. We can think of so many examples, whether it's the Middle East or, you know, where, you know, that would be such an important thing, because of course you relate to each other differently. That's also really why I wanted to record the stories in this book, because my grandparents did grow up in that kind of society, and that contact is lost between the citizens of India and Pakistan today. And I also felt that I've been in such a privileged position, not so, I mean, partly because of having a British passport, although actually for British Indians and British Pakistanis, it can still be difficult, and there are examples of that every day, but really because of my work. I had assignments in India and in Pakistan, and therefore I was conscious I'm the only member of my family who can actually go and seek out these places, who can stand at, you know, who can visit Aligarh Muslim University and think, this is the city, not the university, because my grandmother didn't go there, but this is the city and the environment, the university town of the 1920s and 30s that made my grandmother, that made her so confident and so assured in so many ways. It was because she'd grown up in this kind of environment. And that's what, you know, no one else in my family has had that. So I did feel this sense of responsibility that came from that. You know, and it's so interesting for me to see the similarities and the differences. Yeah. Both are interesting when you cross the border.
And part of the challenge sometimes is, how do you stop history repeating itself? How do you repeat the good bits of history? How do you avoid repeating the bad bits of history? And you very kindly came to the British High Commission in Islamabad a few weeks ago and talked to our staff, and one of our Punjabi heritage members of staff said to you, I've not been able to get my grandparents to talk about partition. They just don't want to talk about it, but I want to know. So perhaps for the younger audience in the room who've got parents, grandparents, how would you advise, should they have conversations about this? How do we learn?
I think anyone in this room who's, you know, where parents and grandparents are still with you, even if you're not necessarily that interested right now, I would strongly say to you, if you can take out your phone and in a voice note, record your elders talking. I wish so much that I'd asked more of these questions directly. And if you can just record in lifetimes as much as possible, and with these apps, it's so easy today to do it. It just means taking the time to sit down with someone. And you never know, it might not even be you who's interested, it might be your son or daughter who's interested one way, but without these records, we have nothing. And so I really urge people, you know, whatever your family's experience, try and record it. And for anyone who really wants to get to grips with their family history, you know, even if you think your parents and grandparents or aunts and uncles are not that knowledgeable, when you ask around, you will generally find people. In every family, I feel there's generally a keeper of the family history, at least one. And they might well be a second cousin or a distant great aunt who you've never met, but there will be that person or that group of people, and you seek them out, and you know they will help you piece together the story essentially of who you are. And it is interesting to me that I think perhaps in the UK, and maybe it's happening in Canada and America, I think those of us who are the children of immigrants, where in many ways our own history is sort of young and not that developed, and so perhaps there's more of a thirst from people like me to really document where we came from, because our roots are more shaky, and perhaps we're not even really sure where our roots are. And so perhaps we're doing more of that digging, but I honestly feel it's, as you grow older, you have much more of a sense of wanting to know who you are. But without the records and without the sources, it's very, very difficult to trace that.
I will throw this open to the floor in a few more minutes for more questions. But before I do, on this identity, having done this book, did you see yourself in a different light?
Actually, I think I ended up seeing myself as more British because of that passport I found. I think I just had a much firmer sense, not just of, you know, the British were in India, we all know that, and not just of the physical things they left behind, but much more of a sense of how, you know, people were how the society worked. Of course it was racially divided and there was a strict hierarchy, but there were all kinds of commonalities and cross-fertilization, including of people. My grandmother was an Anglo-Indian, her father was of Irish descent, her mother was born a Hindu and became a Catholic when they married. And I discovered early on in the book, I've got a twist in that tale, because I discovered that the sequence of the marriage and the children being born, or at least the first child being born, was not exactly the sequence that had, you know, that we had all been told in our family story. So yes, I guess it is. There's been a lot more, as makes sense, a lot more cross-pollination, fertilization, mixing, influences. All of that is part of our heritage. And I think it's really worth remembering that, because we do live in a time where people are really keen, you know, East, West, Muslims, Christians, you know, the British, the immigrants. These lines feel like they're being more firmly and more conclusively drawn. And so I feel like just really knowing our personal heritage and how people fit together is really important. But there is a small, I think, Jane, we haven't really touched on the politics of all of this. And I did feel that I also brought the lens of being a British political journalist to this, because in the 11 years I was on the Today programme, I would interview a government minister or a member of the opposition, or certainly a politician, every day I was on air. And then I did immerse myself in the politics of this time and really marvel and feel aghast at some of the policy decisions that were made. You know, the idea that Prime Minister Attlee made a policy statement in February 1947 saying power is going to be transferred into responsible Indian hands by June 1948. This is an extraordinary policy to announce publicly, because it reduces all incentive for the various parties to agree. You're essentially saying one way or another, we're leaving, and it sort of makes people entrench their positions rather than offer any incentive to compromise. And I also came to the conclusion that really, after the First World War, this was the time when British India should have been made a dominion. It should have been put on a par with Canada and Australia and New Zealand and South Africa and all these other places. And I think the reason it didn't was because there wasn't that would have meant power being transferred to people who were not white. And that was not acceptable at the time. But really, that was the moment where a formula for self-government that would have had to be a cross-community formula for self-government could and should have been found.
I'm aware that the next question I'm going to ask you is not a question I would ask a white man. And I say that in full support of white men. Love white men, they're great. But I wouldn't ask this question to a white man. You have had to fight for space in the UK as both a woman and as a person of colour, space to do an interview, not necessarily your competence, not necessarily being assumed. You've had to prove yourself a lot more than others. And I've seen in your career as you've tried to create that space for other people as well, so that it's a truly merit-based space. Tell us a little bit more about your future plans in this area.
Well, it's interesting. I feel that I didn't really have to fight for my space for a long time. I think in my 20s and 30s, I felt anything was possible. But then, of course, times were different, and I began my journalistic career before 9/11. It was a kinder, gentler time in many ways. And I think that as you become more senior, opportunities also narrow. You know, there are fewer jobs available towards the top of the tree. And I've always felt that the balance I have to strike is the one where I'm true to who I am and to the knowledge and insight that comes with who I am. So just like someone who's been a correspondent in Washington will always be turned to as, you know, what do you think about this particular American story? I had to sort of tell myself that I also have a right and an agency and particular knowledge that I can bring to stories that are relating to Islam or South Asia or the Middle East and places where I've worked and had a lot of experience. But I am conscious that the last year in the news, whether it's been the war in the Middle East or whether it's been the riots in the UK last summer, these times are much harder, and perhaps it's been, but again, I think I've really felt that you have to know your stuff. There is no excuse for not doing your homework. I always felt on the Today program and on the BBC that I was only as good as my last shift or my last interview. And I think every journalist and every person in the public eye needs to feel like that. I think one of the things I can't bear in politics or in any kind of public life is entitlement. Like, none of us are entitled to the jobs and positions we have. We have to earn them, and once we're in those jobs, we have to keep earning them every day. And so I never felt that I, was owed a job or anything like that. I always felt that I had to prove myself, and maybe there was an element of I had to prove myself more because of my background, but ultimately I think I've always felt I had to continuously prove myself as a journalist and prove that I was in command of my brief. So that's how I've seen the world.
Done. Now, I know we're here today to essentially promote this book, but I do want to do a shameless plug for your other book, which is called The Skills, How to Win at Work. And it's absolutely brilliant, but it came out as COVID was breaking, when we were suddenly looking for skills around how to do Zoom calls and to make sure your cat was trapped out of the room. But give us a couple of lines about that, particularly for younger people today trying to work out how to make their way in the world.
Thank you so much for mentioning it, Jane. I will be signing copies of both books at the bookstalls straight after this session, if anyone would like me to do that. And I wrote The Skills because I realized that there were aspects of my broadcast life and things I'd learned in the course of my broadcast life which I thought did translate. And there were things like, people, obviously, we both work in the public eye in different ways. And you learn so much as you go along. Experience teaches you so much. There are many pitfalls. Someone could ask you a question right now. I could ask a stupid question on air or get my words mixed up, and we'll, face a Twitter storm or worse. And we live with that peril. And you have to find a way to, and the only answer is to be as good as you possibly can. But yes, in the book I did write, and I tried to do it in as much a bite-sized takeaway as I can. It is about voice and pitching for yourself. I learned quite late in life that I could happily tell you why Jane is brilliant at what she does, but I would find it much harder to articulate why, in a few words, why I was deserving of the next opportunity. And I kind of shied away from that. And maybe, again, that was part of the way I'd been brought up. But then I realized, actually, of course, you do need to be able to articulate for yourself. You owe it to yourself to be able to do that. And there are ways to do that which are not bombastic. And the way to do that is essentially to root it in actual fact. It's perfectly fine to say, I'd really like that next opportunity because I've done X, Y, and Z in the last year. So I felt in some ways that in articulating for myself and putting myself forward, I found my courage quite late. And early in my career, I think lots of things came my way quite easily, and I never really had to put myself forward. And then I had to figure out how to do it at a later stage. Also, like many women, your career gets disrupted by having children. You come back from maternity leave, you have to prove yourself again, and you can feel very unnerved by being out of the workplace in that time. So women or men, I've tried to put together like some scenarios and some ways that I've approached them and what I've learned, in the real hope that they'll be useful to people, whatever your field and your context.
We've been talking for too long. I do have more questions, but I want to hear questions from the audience. So if we can get the lights up, please, and stick your hand up. There's a person, at least one person running around with a mic. Oh, there's lots of you in there. The mic guy is going to choose.
Hi, Michelle. My question is regarding Broken Threads. How much of the decision to write this particular story was informed by your access to the source material? And had you not had the access that you do have, or did have, would you still have gone about to tell this story, and what would you have done differently in that case?
So I'm going to take 3 questions, I'm afraid, because I've not
Oh,
left
at a time.
enough
Yes,
audience
yes. Okay,
time.
okay.
And there are a couple of women up there.
Yeah.
If someone can run up there with the microphone. I can see standing up guy, but let me... Okay, can we get the microphone up there? Then if we can get another mic pre-positioned to the lady in blue there.
Hello, I hope you're doing well. I'm a student from the Horror Grammar School Defense, and my question for you is, given your grandparents' story of perseverance in the face of adversity, what are the most important values for leaders today which are going through global conflicts and cultural misunderstandings, and how has your grandparents' story influenced your personal and professional identity as a whole?
Thank you. Okay.
Okay, let's take one more. Go on then, standing up guy.
Over there.
Oh, I've lost the microphone, it's over there. Okay.
Assalamu alaikum. Firstly, I am honored to be here to experience such an insightful conversation. And so my question would be that you portrayed your mother and grandmother as liberating templates amidst traditional expectations. So how do you think this maternal perspective shaped your family's understanding of gender roles from empire to independence?
Brilliant, thank
okay.
you. Let's take those 3.
Okay, so the question about whether I would have made the decision to write had I not had these sources. The strange thing is, I didn't feel I had great sources at the beginning. So it seems obvious now, and lots of people have said to me, you're very lucky you had these sources, like as if it was really easy to write the book. It is not easy to write any book, and it was not easy to write this book. Often I came off air at 9 in the morning, and you know, I lived like my day job in the news and current affairs world, and in my dreams, it's like I was living in the world of 1920 and non-cooperation, or Burma and the Second World War, and I was like in 2 different places all the time. So I didn't feel I had great sources. I knew that I knew my grandfather Shahid had written books, but you know, they were quite impersonal books. And a lot of times I'd want in them, like, what were you thinking? What were you saying to your wife? Like this was absent from it. It was only after I began writing that my mother said, "Oh, I think I've got some tapes somewhere where I'd recorded my mother," as in my grandmother, her mother, talking. So I discovered those like midway. I also, until I started talking to my great aunt, I didn't know how good that material would be, and it was good. So it didn't feel like a rich source material, but even so, the book. So I would say to anyone, even if you feel you're thinking of doing something like that and you don't feel your sources are great, make a start, because honestly, once you start, you find more and more and more. And in the end, I was like, I cannot open that door. This is too much. I think there are a couple of cousins of mine who were quite offended because I said to one, yes, I'll ring you and I'll talk about our grandmother. And then I never did. And I think he's not happy. But I really started to have too much, but it was not like that at the beginning. So please persevere even when you feel you don't have much, because that was how I felt. So on my grandparents and their values and how I've been influenced by their values, I think more than anything, actually, they had real fortitude. And I think that's probably something which we have lost with the times, because our lives are generally much more comfortable. Like, we have many more creature comforts. My grandfather Mumtaz was writing about, he's growing up with no electricity, and I'm conscious that there are people, obviously in Pakistan today, who are growing up in exactly that same way. So I'm speaking from a position of privilege, but incredible fortitude. And they don't live in an age of mass media. So, you know, information is so hard to come by. They work so hard to get information. I was able to look up, you know, what happened to their friends after independence on the internet. So my grandfather Mumtaz's Hindu and Sikh professors at King Edward, I could find out things he never knew about what happened to them. I've made contact in India with Shahid and Taira's friends, children and grandchildren. You know, these are all things that were beyond them. So I think real fortitude and an acceptance of life, no complaining, no saying we're so hard done by. This is a part of my life, but in no way to the extent that it was part of theirs. And on women, I think that I was certainly, you know, even though, like, my great-grandmothers were not going to school, but the acquisition of knowledge was definitely a part of their lives. And I think that goes to what Aisha Jalal was saying, that the quest for knowledge, it was absolutely inherent in communities where, you know, women may have been in parda and they may have been in the burqa, but it did not mean that they were not reading and writing at home, whether it was, you know, their education would start with the Quran, but it would go far beyond that. People would learn poetry by heart and recite it. So I think it would be far too simplistic to think that these were women who were backward in some way. They didn't have opportunity, and they didn't have opportunity outside the home. But the common thread was the quest for knowledge and the desire and the absolute imperative to be as good a person as you can be and to make the best of your circumstances and the best of your life. So, and, you know, I think that was an absolutely common thread. So, of course, gender equality is a difficult issue in many parts of the world, including this one. But I felt I had examples in my family early on where women were doing, you know, striving for the height. And also, I had a great-grandmother who grew up in the walled city of Lahore, who again lost her father in early life. And she and her mother would buy the unhusked grain from the bazaar and then, you know, remove the husks on the roof of their house in old Lahore. And I wish I knew where exactly that house was. And, you know, like this, and they would chano it and then they would sell it. And that was how they kept the brothers in school. And one of the brothers went on to be Khalifa Abdul Hakim, who was a great thinker of Lahore. And so, you know, the sisters did that to keep the brothers in school. But the sisters were also learned. And so I feel all of that is a part of me.
Michelle's saying all good interviews have to come to an end, and I'm afraid that that's also true for this discussion. There's lots more questions, lots more thoughts. You can catch up with Michelle, buy her book, sign it, ask her a question. I suspect she'll still be here at the end of the day, still answering all of your brilliant questions.
And I thank you so much, Jane, because, you know, this is not your day job, but clearly you could have had a whole alternative career, and maybe there's still time after the Foreign Office. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I have to say, as someone who is, you're usually in control doing the interviews, you're also a brilliant interviewee. So, Michelle Hussain, thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Jane.
Indeed.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank
Khuda Hafiz.